Brian leaned back in his chair and grinned. We can give her half of your salary. Aurora, it's just business. Nothing private. With the birthday card my coworkers had signed for me just hours before still in my handbag, I gazed at him across his desk. He went on swiftly, so I guess he could see the horror on my face. Hey, Heather has been here for 6 months. You did a good job training her. Honestly, we don't need 2 persons doing the same task, and the pharmaceutical database system is operating without a hitch. I spoke slowly and steadily, saying, Heather understands the fundamentals, but she is not familiar with the integration points and the system architecture. Brian dismissively waved his hand. Everything is listed in your process manuals, correct? I'm paying you for it. In addition, young talent offers new insights. The sector is changing. Aurora Chin is my name. 41 years of age. Additionally, I was Medisync Pharmaceutical Services Senior Database Integration Specialist until 5 minutes ago. I created and oversaw the intricate system that monitored medication trials across several platforms for 3 years, tying research data to the national pharmaceutical firm's regulatory reporting needs. I was happy to have Heather on board when Brian recruited her 6 months ago. Having someone handle the daily operations would allow me to make the adjustments I'd been considering for months because the system had become more complicated. The underlying architecture, the unseen connecting tissue that made everything function flawlessly, hadn't been covered in the many hours I'd spent educating her and carefully guiding her through the regular processes. Sliding a severance agreement over the desk, Brian said, I need your key card and passwords before you leave today. Pay for 2 weeks. Typical confidentiality agreements. The text in the document were a little fuzzy when I scanned it. I said, today is my birthday, even though it sounded phony to me. For a second, Brian had the grace to appear uneasy. I apologized for the timing. The date was chosen by HR. I stood up after mechanically signing the agreement. In the event that systems fail to synchronize correctly, Heather will require the emergency procedures. The documentation does not contain them. As he checked his phone, Brian answered, I'm sure she'll figure it out. She is incredibly resourceful. Heather came over as I was packing my desk, looking both uneasy and sympathetic. I sincerely apologize, she muttered. I was unaware that this was taking place. I gave her my system notepad and nodded, not believing I could talk. My computer screen displayed the following notification: Database sync problem on client trial DRX 1-1429. Resolution must be done manually. As I began to explain the mistake, Brian came and ushered me out. He stated resolutely, Heather has this. Now is the time for you to leave. I gave a stiff smile. I said, good luck, with more sincerity than either of them could possibly comprehend. After 15 years in database architecture, I started my journey to Medisync. I have developed systems for retail chains, insurance organizations, and, lastly, the pharmaceutical sector, where maintaining data integrity might actually mean the difference between life and death. Clinical trial information had to be seamlessly integrated across research platforms, regulatory submission systems, and client dashboards with zero margin for error. When Medisync recruited me, they were struggling with an outdated system that frequently crashed. Within 6 months, I'd redesigned their entire architecture, creating a robust integration framework that accommodated their complex needs while maintaining regulatory compliance. Client satisfaction scores rose dramatically, and the company landed 3 major pharmaceutical contracts, based largely on the strength of their innovative data management solutions I had built from the ground up. Brian Morgan became my manager a year ago when the previous director retired. He had a background in sales rather than technology, which initially concerned me, but I tried to be open-minded. He spoke constantly about optimization and streamlining operations, often questioning why processes couldn't be simplified. These verification steps seem excessive, he'd comment during review meetings. Couldn't we eliminate some of these redundancies? I'd patiently explain that what looked like redundancy was actually essential error-catching architecture. The system's strength lay in its multiple verification points that prevented data corruption from cascading through interconnected databases. Brian would nod, but I could tell he wasn't fully grasping the technical nuances. Still, I believed his business perspective complemented my technical expertise, and we maintained a cordial, professional relationship. When he hired Heather, fresh out of college with a computer science degree but no real-world experience, I didn't object. Training a junior colleague seemed reasonable, and I enjoyed sharing my knowledge. Heather was eager and quick to learn the operational procedures, though she sometimes grew impatient with details. "Do we really need to run all these verification queries?" she'd ask. "It adds an hour to the process." "That hour prevents weeks of potential disaster recovery," I'd explain. "The system is more fragile than it appears." In recent weeks, I'd noticed Brian and Heather in frequent private meetings. I assumed they were discussing her professional development, perhaps planning to expand her responsibilities. I even prepared additional training materials, anticipating that she might take over some of my routine tasks. What I didn't anticipate was becoming completely expendable. In retrospect, the signs were there: Brian's increasing questions about whether my processes could be streamlined, his interest in detailed documentation, the gradual exclusion from strategic meetings. But I'd been too focused on improving the system and training my replacement to see what was happening. The morning after my unceremonious termination, I woke to a string of LinkedIn notifications. News of my departure had apparently spread quickly through professional circles. 3 former colleagues had sent messages expressing shock and asking if I was looking for new opportunities. I spent the day updating my resume and researching positions, trying to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the humiliation of being escorted from the building on my birthday. By evening, I'd lined up 2 promising interviews for later in the week. The pharmaceutical data integration field was specialized enough that experienced architects were always in demand. My phone rang just after dinner. It was Jacob, a developer from my former team at Medisync. "Aurora, I know you probably don't want to talk about work, but I'm stuck on something," he said, his voice tight with stress. "The DRX 1429 trial database is showing inconsistencies after the routine Sunday update. I've tried everything in your documentation, but nothing's working." I remembered the error notification I'd seen just before leaving. "Did you run the verification sequence on the secondary tables?" I asked. "Yes, but the systems aren't reconciling. Heather said to just force an override, but that doesn't seem right." I winced. "Definitely don't do that. It could corrupt the entire trial dataset." "That's what I thought," Jacob sighed. "I told Brian we should call you, but he said we needed to handle it." Careful not to violate the confidentiality agreement I'd signed, I hung up feeling a curious mix of vindication and concern. The system I'd built was intricate, with carefully designed failsafes and interconnection points that weren't immediately obvious without understanding the underlying architecture. 2 more calls came in that evening from different team members, each describing escalating problems. Apparently, Heather had indeed attempted to force an override, which had triggered cascading errors across multiple client databases. The team was now in emergency mode, trying to prevent data corruption from spreading. I declined to answer the 4th call, which came from Brian's number just before midnight. The next morning, Tuesday, I had an early interview with PJ Direct, one of MedicSync's competitors. The hiring manager, impressed with my portfolio, asked why I'd left my previous position. "Restructuring," I said simply. "They decided to streamline the database management team." He looked skeptical. "Interesting timing. We just heard MedicSync is having major system issues, something about corrupted trial data." I kept my expression neutral. "I wouldn't know. I'm no longer with the company." By Wednesday, I had received official offers from both Pharma Direct and another competitor, each with significantly higher salaries than what I'd made at MedicSync. A 3rd company requested an interview, mentioning they'd heard excellent things about my architecture skills. Meanwhile, my phone continued to accumulate missed calls from Brian and other MedicSync numbers. I didn't return them. The severance agreement didn't include any provision requiring me to provide assistance after termination, and professional ethics prevented me from discussing their system with competitors. But as the calls became more frequent, I wondered just how badly things were unraveling at my former workplace. By Thursday morning, my curiosity got the better of me. I accepted Brian's call on the first ring. "Aurora," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank God. We have a situation." "So I've heard," I replied neutrally. "Look, I'll be direct. The system is in complete meltdown. After that initial error on Monday, everything started falling apart. Client dashboards are showing incorrect data, trial records are mismatched, and the regulatory submission module is flagging compliance errors across the board." I closed my eyes, visualizing the cascade of failures, exactly what I designed the verification protocols to prevent. "Brian, I signed a severance agreement. I'm no longer an employee." "I understand that," he said quickly. "We'd bring you back as a consultant. Name your rate. We just need you to fix this." The offer was tempting, not for the money, but for the satisfaction of being proven right. However, I knew better than to rush into anything. I'd need full system access and complete autonomy to implement solutions. I said absolutely. Brian agreed immediately. "Whatever you need. I'll think about it and get back to you this afternoon." After hanging up, I called Jacob for an unofficial assessment of the situation. His description confirmed my suspicions. Heather had implemented emergency fixes that had only worsened the problems, not understanding how each system interconnected with the others. "It's bad, Aurora," Jacob said quietly. "Faddyne is threatening to pull their contract. That's 30% of the company's revenue, and there's talk about potential legal action if trial data has been compromised." I spent the morning weighing my options. The professional part of me wanted to rescue the system I'd built. The human part of me felt a certain satisfaction in Brian's desperation. By noon, I'd made my decision and called him back. "I'll help," I said. "My consulting rate is $300 an hour, with a minimum engagement of 40 hours, payable upfront." Brian didn't even hesitate. "Done. When can you start?" "I'll be there in an hour." Walking back into MedicSync felt surreal. Colleagues greeted me with obvious relief, while Brian hovered anxiously nearby. Heather was noticeably absent. "Where's Heather?" I asked as Brian escorted me to a workstation. "She called in sick today," he said, not meeting my eyes. The stress of the situation. I logged into the system with the admin credentials Brian provided and began my assessment. The damage was extensive, but followed a logical pattern, exactly what happens when someone who doesn't understand the architecture tries to force solutions without addressing the underlying issues. By late afternoon, I had stabilized the most critical systems and developed a recovery plan for the rest. Brian checked in frequently, each time more relieved as progress became evident. "You're a lifesaver," he said during one such visit. "I don't know what we were thinking letting you go." I continued working without responding. The comment wasn't worth acknowledging. As I was preparing to leave for the day, Brian approached with a folder. "I've been authorized to offer you your job back," he said, pushing the documents toward me, with a 15% raise and a more senior title. I glanced at the offer letter without touching it. "I'll consider it after we resolve the current crisis." "Of course," he nodded eagerly. "Take your time." But as I gathered my things, I noticed an email on Brian's open laptop on the desk beside me. It was from the CEO, with the subject line, "Transition Plan." "Once the system is stabilized," the visible preview text read, "get everything documented properly this time before we make any changes." I felt a chill. They weren't offering my job back out of recognition of my value. They simply needed me to repair the system and document everything so thoroughly that even Heather could maintain it. Then they'd discard me again. The decision I thought I had was just another illusion. The next morning, I arrived early to continue my recovery work. The system was responding well to my corrections, and I estimated another 2 or 3 days before everything would be fully functional again. I worked methodically, carefully documenting each step, not for Brian's future transition plan, but for my own records. Around midday, the CEO, Victoria Winters, stopped by my workstation. "Aurora, I can't tell you how pleased we are that you've returned to help us through this crisis," she said warmly. "Brian speaks very highly of your expertise." I nodded politely, continuing to type. "The system should be stable by Monday." "Wonderful. And I understand Brian has discussed your potential return to a permanent position." "He mentioned it," I replied, keeping my focus on the screen. Victoria's smile tightened slightly at my lukewarm response. "Well, we'd be delighted to have you back on the team. Perhaps once this situation is resolved, we could discuss the specifics over lunch." "Perhaps," I agreed, non-committal. After she left, I took a short break, stepping outside for fresh air. As I scrolled through my phone, a message appeared from an unfamiliar number. "Aurora, it's Heather. Can we talk? It's important." Curious, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop across the street during my lunch break. When I arrived, Heather was already there, looking pale and nervous. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. "I've been trying to decide whether to tell you this." "Tell me what?" Heather glanced around before leaning forward. "The system failure wasn't an accident. At least, not entirely. I felt my body go still." "Explain." "Brian asked me to implement some optimizations to the system last week, changes that would streamline the verification processes. He said you had approved the concept but were too busy to implement it yourself." "I never approved any such changes," I said, my voice tight. "I realized that later." Heather admitted, "When things started going wrong on Monday, I told Brian we needed to call you immediately. He refused, saying it would validate your over-complicated approach and that we could fix it ourselves." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text exchange with Brian from Monday morning. His messages clearly instructed her to attempt fixes without contacting me, even as she expressed increasing concern about the escalating problems. By the time he finally decided to call you, I was having panic attacks. I couldn't sleep knowing what we'd done to the system, what I'd done by trusting him. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Heather's eyes filled with tears. "Because they're planning to blame me for everything. Yesterday, HR called me in and said they're conducting an investigation into procedural violations that led to the system failure. Brian told them I made unauthorized changes against his instructions. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Brian had deliberately undermined the system architecture I'd built, likely to prove that his streamlined approach was superior. Whenever everything collapsed, he needed me to fix it, but afterward, Heather would take the fall, and he would emerge as the manager who handled the crisis. "I have the job offer from Fad Direct," Heather continued. "I was going to accept it before all this happened. Now Brian's threatening to give me a negative reference if I leave. He says he'll make sure I can't work in pharmaceutical data anywhere." I felt a surge of anger, not just for myself now, but for Heather too. She was younger and less experienced, but she didn't deserve to be manipulated and scapegoated. "Forward me those texts," I said, my mind racing, "and any other communications you have about the system changes." As Heather compiled the evidence, I realized I had a decision to make. I could walk away with my consulting fee and one of my new job offers, leaving Medisync to its toxic culture, or I could take action that might help Heather and perhaps other employees while exposing Brian and sabotage. The choice was obvious. Back at Medisync, I continued the recovery work with renewed purpose. While my hands fixed the technical issues, my mind developed a different kind of solution. What I needed was irrefutable evidence of Brian's deliberate actions, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or technical confusion. I recalled something Jacob had mentioned. All system changes were automatically logged on a secure server for regulatory compliance purposes. Those logs would show exactly who had authorized the optimizations and when they were implemented. During a moment when the office was mostly empty, I accessed the compliance server and found what I was looking for. The logs clearly showed Brian had used his administrative override to approve significant changes to the verification protocols, changes that directly contradicted the system architecture documentation. Most damning of all, he had backdated the approval to make it appear these changes had been pending for weeks, implying my tacit acceptance. I downloaded the logs to a secure drive and then sent myself an encrypted email with the files attached. For good measure, I took screenshots showing the timestamps of the original changes versus the backdated approvals. Now, I needed to understand who else was involved. Had Victoria known about Brian's plan to sabotage the system, or was she merely complicit in using the crisis as an opportunity to rehire me temporarily? The answer came unexpectedly when Brian's calendar notification popped up on his laptop during our afternoon status meeting. Discuss AC transition plan with VW, 4:30 p.m. I need a bit more time on the regulatory module, I told Brian. Probably another hour. You go ahead to your meeting. Once he left, I quickly finished my work on the system, then set up one final safety measure, a hidden diagnostic tool that would alert me to any unauthorized changes to the core architecture, sending notifications directly to my personal email. It wasn't technically part of my consulting agreement, but I justified it as professional due diligence. At 5:15 p.m., I packed up my things and prepared to leave for the weekend. The system was now 80% recovered, with only minor issues remaining that I could resolve remotely. As I passed the conference room, I heard Brian's voice rising in frustration. But she's fixing everything. Can't we at least wait until Monday? Victoria's response was cool and clear. The decision is made. Once she submits the final documentation, we thank her for her consulting work and proceed with the transition to the simplified architecture. Heather was just a trial run. We've already identified another junior developer who can maintain the streamlined system at an even lower salary point. And if it fails again, it won't, because Aurora will have documented every aspect of the recovery process. That's the whole point of bringing her back as a consultant. I'd heard enough. I slipped away before they could exit the conference room, a strange calm settling over me. I now had all the evidence I needed and a weekend to decide exactly how to use it. Sunday evening, I received a text from Brian. System looking stable. Just need final documentation tomorrow to close out your consulting engagement. CEO wants to meet at 9 a.m. I responded simply, I'll be there. What Brian didn't know was that I'd spent the weekend consulting with both a labor attorney and a regulatory compliance expert at the FDA, who had expressed significant concern about the deliberate manipulation of pharmaceutical trial data systems. I had also accepted the position at Pharma Direct with a specific condition. They had happily accommodated it. Monday morning would bring answers to questions Brian and Victoria didn't even know to ask, and I would be ready. I arrived at Medisync at exactly 9 a.m. Monday, carrying a slim portfolio containing my consulting invoice and several other carefully prepared documents. Victoria's executive assistant showed me into the conference room where Victoria, Brian, and two people I didn't recognize, a woman in a severe suit and a nervous-looking man with a legal pad, were already seated. Aurora, thank you for coming, Victoria began with practiced warmth. This is Patricia from HR and Jonathan from Legal. They're here to formalize the conclusion of your consulting engagement. I smiled pleasantly. How convenient. I've brought some documentation that requires legal review as well. Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened again. Jacob entered, followed by Heather and two men in dark suits who definitely weren't Medisync employees. What is the meaning of this? Victoria demanded, half rising from her chair. I invited a few additional participants, I said calmly. Jacob and Heather have first-hand knowledge relevant to our discussion, and these gentlemen are from the FDA's Office of Regulatory Compliance. They're very interested in the events of the past week. The color drained from Brian's face. The FDA? This is an internal company matter. Actually, one of the agents interrupted. Deliberate tampering with systems that manage pharmaceutical trial data falls squarely within our jurisdiction. Miss Chun contacted our office with evidence suggesting serious compliance violations. I disseminated copies of a thorough report that covered the system design, the unlawful alterations, the attempted cover-up, and the effect on the integrity of customer data while also opening my portfolio. My signature and sworn declaration were on the last page. I slipped the original across to Victoria and stated, "This constitutes my final documentation as requested." Additionally, I've agreed to start working for Pharma Direct tomorrow. Implementing a rescue plan for all medicine clients who want to move their data to a more reliable platform is my first task. At last, Victoria lost her cool. "This is impossible. Contracts with explicit performance assurances pertaining to data integrity are in place for certain clients." I corrected her. "You've violated the guarantees. The pertinent provisions have previously been examined by my lawyer." The FDA officials started posing sharp queries regarding verification and change management processes. I nodded to Jacob and Heather and gently excused myself while the interview went on. I had completed my task here. I was sitting in my new corner office at Pharma Direct 6 months later, looking over the quarterly performance report. Thanks in part to Jacob and Heather, who had both joined me at the new firm, the transition of former med clients had gone very well. There was a brief mention in the industry publication on my desk that Medisync had been purchased by a bigger rival during a period of high client churn and regulatory difficulties. After an FDA probe involving data integrity issues, Victoria and Brian had both looked for other positions. A calendar reminder for a video conference with our newest pharmaceutical client, once Medisync's biggest account, buzzed on my phone. Citing my outstanding reputation for system integrity, their research director had explicitly asked me to personally supervise their data architecture. Heather tapped on my doorframe as I was getting ready for the call. "The team wanted me to remind you about the celebration dinner tonight," she stated. "1 year since we all started here." I grinned as I recalled the day I had worked out a deal with the CEO of Pharma Direct to include Jacob and Heather on my team as part of my job requirements. He had been dubious until I clarified their possible worth and their commitment to supplying information that revealed Medisync's transgressions. I wouldn't miss it, I told her. The diagnostic system I had developed informed me that all customer databases had successfully finished their verification cycles, and my new email notification chimed. Using the knowledge I gained from my work at Medisync, the architecture I created here was much more resilient. While some may consider what transpired to be retaliation, I had a different perspective. It was only the inevitable result of valuing systems more than the individuals who created them, of putting expediency ahead of knowledge and morality. I hadn't had to ruin Medisync after all. Without my assistance, their own lack of vision had accomplished it rather successfully. In order to show our new customer once more the importance of doing things correctly, I closed the performance report and got ready for our meeting.